Father-in-law forbade my daughter's boyfriend from joining us for Christmas, so we're skipping the in-laws' holiday gathering. My daughter and her boyfriend, let's call him Dan, decided to move in together in August. I'll admit, it happened fast. They'd only been together for 6 months. But they're both adults, and they made their choice after serious conversations about their future, including marriage. I'm convinced these two are in it for the long haul. Even when Dan had to leave for training this month, and they'll be long distance for a while, both of them made it clear they want to live together as soon as they end up in the same city again. Now, my father-in-law, FIL, is a lot, to put it mildly. He's your stereotypical rich old white guy, completely accustomed to having everything his way. Back in November, he and my mother-in-law, MIL, came to visit my daughter, and for reasons he never bothered to explain, Phil decided he didn't like Dan. Not a single reason, he just didn't warm up to him. Personally, I suspect it's either the speed at which they moved in together, or possibly because Dan is a person of color and we're white, though Phil would never admit that. That's just the sense I get. Here's where things get messy. Dan's family will be away for Christmas and he would have been spending the holiday alone, so of course we insisted he join us. To us, he's already part of the family. As we usually do, we had been planning an overnight visit to my in-laws over the holidays. We figured we'd all go together, including Dan. My partner was on the phone with his dad, going over the logistics, and he mentioned that Dan would be staying with us for Christmas. He took care to make it clear that including Dan in the overnight plans was up to my in-laws. It was their house, their rules. What never crossed my mind was that they might actually exclude Dan. But then my Phil threw a fit. He said he didn't want that boy, and Dan is 24, anywhere in his house. Didn't consult with my Mill, who actually adores Dan, just outright refused. My partner stood his ground and told his father that Dan was absolutely coming for the holidays with us, and he accepted that Phil has the right to decide who's welcome in his home. He suggested his parents at least talk it over together before locking in their choice, and even offered a compromise. Why not have everyone meet for lunch or dinner, somewhere halfway? But that didn't go over at all. Phil just doubled down, snapped that it was his house and his decision, and insisted his word was final, no discussion. He's just that guy, control to the bitter end. The irony? My in-laws are devout Christians, always preaching compassion and family. So much for a holiday of love and acceptance. Now, I found myself agonizing over what to tell our daughter and Dan. I was livid at my Phil's attitude, absolutely disgusted. If it were only up to me, I'd tell my daughter exactly what her grandfather said, that Dan was explicitly not welcome. But my partner wanted to spare our daughter's feelings, suggesting we simply say the overnight visit with the grandparents didn't pan out, so she wouldn't have to be angry with them. I feel differently. She's an adult, and she deserves to know the truth and react however she needs to. I know I'm angry enough for all of us. I kept asking myself, how should I handle this? My loyalty is to my daughter, but I also want to respect my partner's wishes since these are his parents. What would be the right way to deal with this? As if things weren't convoluted enough, I should clarify a few household details. My partner and I are married, though I usually say partner instead of husband. It's also worth noting Phil refers to my brother-in-law as that boy too, and he's white, so I can't say for certain if this is racially motivated or if Phil just doesn't like new people. As of now, heading to the in-laws for Christmas is off the table, even if Phil changes his tune. At most, we're debating whether to meet up for lunch, but only if Dan is included. My feeling is, if my daughter is mature enough to live with Dan, she's mature enough to hear the truth about her grandfather. She'll be better prepared if this drama rears its head again when it comes time for an engagement or wedding. There's no need to embellish, just the truth. Phil made it embarrassingly clear Dan isn't welcome with the family on Christmas. I honestly believe this isn't just a holiday scheduling conflict, this is Grandpa throwing a full-grown toddler tantrum because he can't control the narrative. My daughter and Dan are adults, making adult decisions. Phil is the only one still stuck at the kids' table emotionally. My partner wants to avoid upset, but hiding the reason for the changed plans is just delayed tactics. It doesn't solve anything. Eventually, my daughter would notice if Grandpa keeps coincidentally sidelining her partner. Better she knows now, so she can decide what she wants to do about it. If Grandpa wants to make up rules like no shoes, no hats, no Dan, he'll have to live with the consequences that people might not want to be part of his plans anymore. Tonight, after a long talk with my husband, we decided the natural repercussions for Phil's behavior is that we're not spending Christmas there. At most, a lunch, with Dan included. I will not pressure my daughter or Dan to sit through a potentially ugly or awkward lunch. She deserves to know exactly what her grandfather said, and then she can choose whether she wants to keep up any kind of relationship with him at all. Maybe she won't want to subject someone she loves to an uncomfortable family meal with a grandfather who refuses to apologize, racist or not. Update 1. The debate is still raging in my house. The real issue isn't even the in-laws anymore, it's what my husband and I are supposed to tell our daughter about why that visit got cancelled. He wants to give her the neat, cutesy version, just say the dates didn't work out. Absolutely not. I want to tell her the truth, or at the very least, have her ask her grandfather directly why the visit isn't happening. I never expected things to spiral so quickly, but here I am, frustrated after several difficult conversations with my husband. None of them have gone even remotely well. I've tried to explain, again and again, that I won't be complicit in a lie of omission. Telling our daughter that it's just a scheduling conflict isn't fair to her, nor is it the truth. I refuse to smooth things over to protect anyone's ego, especially my father-in-law's. Frankly, I feel like my husband is more interested in shielding his father from the consequences of his actions than protecting our daughter from the truth. He doesn't see it that way. He keeps insisting he's just trying to protect her. According to him, the consequence is clear enough: his parents miss out on our overnight visit. Case closed. But that doesn't sit right with me. I finally put my foot down and told him outright that I won't lie to her. If she comes to me and asks why we aren't going, I will tell her she needs to speak to her grandfather about it. He's the one who made this call. He can explain his decision to her face. I wanted to splurt out that her grandfather said Dan isn't welcome, but I won't do that for him. I won't do his dirty work. I'm going to make sure she asks, too, because the very idea of her and Dan sitting through a polite lunch with someone who so obviously disapproves of Dan makes me furious. The reason hardly matters at this point. My daughter deserves to know what's being said about someone important to her, and my father-in-law has a responsibility to look her in the eye and tell her himself. That way, she can actually make her own decision about whether she wants to attend at all. And to be completely honest, if she chooses not to go, I refuse to go too. She's got to know that I am backing her up 100%, no hesitation, no compromise. She needs to know I am in her corner always. Right now, things in my house feel icy and tense. My husband and I keep circling around the argument, making no progress. I have no idea which way this is going to play out, but as soon as I know more, I'll update. If my daughter is old enough to have a boyfriend living with her, then she's old enough to handle honesty. She deserves nothing less. What's the plan when they're married, or if this goes on for years? Is her dad just going to keep feeding her cover stories and half-truths? I'm not having it. Update 2. Well, here I go again. I still haven't had a chance to talk to my daughter. We were supposed to sit down yesterday, but it didn't happen, so that conversation is still up in the air. In the meantime, I did have another, much deeper talk with my husband about everything that's been going on, and what I discovered genuinely surprised me. He's actually way more upset about the situation than I realized, and most of that anger is directed at his own father. My husband is furious that his dad apparently rejected Dan without a real reason. He made it clear to me that he likes Dan, that he's always gotten along with him, and can't for the life of him understand why his father is acting this way. So, no, he doesn't share his father's views at all. What came out most, though, was just how hard it's been for him his whole life, always having to be the peacemaker in his family. He's been stuck in this role of mediating between his parents, smoothing things over between siblings and parents, even handling friction between his parents and me. His family runs away from conflict in a way that's practically an Olympic sport, and somehow, he became the one responsible for keeping everyone calm and civil. He hates it, really hates it, but feels totally stuck. I knew about their conflict avoidance before, but I never realized just how damaging it has been to him. We talked about all of this for a long time, and I think, in the end, we both felt a bit lighter afterwards. That's not even the big update, though. After our last discussion, my husband actually did pick up the phone and call his dad again. Now, I know a lot of people might expect this all to boil down to racism. That Dan, who is my daughter's boyfriend and is a person of color, was rejected for that reason. Or maybe that Dan is just a con man, or said something outrageous. I'm sorry to disappoint, but it isn't any of that. My father-in-law is just a grumpy old man, apparently, who believes that young people shouldn't be living in sin. Yes, that's a direct quote. Initially, when I floated the idea to my husband that his father's dislike could be racially motivated, my husband wasn't convinced but wasn't completely sure either. So, during their conversation, he decided to just ask him, point blank. Did it bother him that Dan is a POC? At that, my father-in-law was absolutely horrified. He asked if he had ever said or done anything to make us, or Dan, believe that, and, in truth, my husband and I couldn't come up with anything concrete outside of one thing. The time he referred to Dan as that boy in the context of not wanting him to come for Christmas. Full disclosure, that suspicion and misreading was all on me. In my head, I put too much weight on that boy comment, thinking it had some ugly undertones. But honestly, he's always called my white brother-in-law that boy, too. I was the one who leapt to that conclusion, and I introduced the suspicion to my husband. I feel terrible about it. I truly did think my father-in-law could be a bigot, but I let one offhand sentence color nearly 30 years of knowing him. I've apologized to my husband for assuming the worst, and I will apologize to my Phil, too. During that same conversation, my Phil actually offered to talk directly to Dan and our daughter if they felt offended. He wanted to clear the air. My husband explained that, actually, it was us who suspected this issue might have been racially motivated, not them. Now my father-in-law is understandably angry that we could have thought that of him, so now I have some damage control to do. I'll be calling him today to apologize, and to talk things through. But, as for why he doesn't want Dan in his house for Christmas? It's much simpler, and, frankly, very old-fashioned. He doesn't approve of my daughter and Dan living together. According to him, they're too young, moved in too fast, and since they aren't even engaged, it's not appropriate. My in-laws are devout Christians, so the living in sin thing is very real to them. Sometimes I swear my Phil is living in a time capsule from the 1960s. That's the sticking point for him. Adding to that, he thinks they moved in together too quickly, only 6 months into dating. He didn't realize they've been together for a full year now and are already talking about marriage. My daughter says they do plan to marry, they're just waiting until their professional training is complete to make it official. My Phil didn't know that. He was also under the impression that Dan was freeloading off our daughter because, during one of their visits, Dan didn't have a job. In reality, Dan was paying his own share from his savings while waiting for his full-time vocational training to start. He's actually moving away for his training, so they'll be long distance until he secures a very stable job. This, too, was news to my father-in-law. So, does my Phil approve of Dan now? No, he's still uptight and disapproves of their living arrangements before marriage. Is he willing to have Dan stay overnight? Still no. But is he a racist jerk? Also no, he's just a cranky, old-fashioned 80-year-old who can't wrap his head around how the world has changed. And that's where we stand. We're still not going to the in-laws for Christmas. Dan is still unwelcome overnight at their house, but at least now I finally understand why. The next step, what do I say to my daughter? The honest truth. Her grandfather isn't comfortable having Dan stay overnight since they aren't even engaged, and it is his house. We have to respect that. Instead, we'll try to meet up for a lunch somewhere, and she and Dan are welcome to join us if they choose. I'll be encouraging her to speak to her grandfather directly, so they can clear the air for themselves. Update 3. First, I had the conversation with my father-in-law. It was short and, for the most part, cordial. I apologized for assuming that when he referred to Dan as boy, he was making a comment about Dan being a person of color dating his granddaughter. I explained to him that word is often considered a slur against people of color, and that's why I reacted the way I did. He grudgingly accepted my apology. He pointed out that he calls my brother-in-law boy too. My brother-in-law, incidentally, is white, and he didn't mean anything by it other than a male younger than himself. As some people suggested, I told him that even if he didn't intend it to be insulting, it still was. That caught him off guard. He asked if I thought my brother-in-law was offended when he said it to him. So I asked if he'd ever called my brother-in-law boy to his face. He went quiet. I pointed out that if he truly thought it wasn't an insult, why didn't he say it directly to his face? He harumphed and muttered something about people being too sensitive, but I'm pretty sure the point landed. We moved on. I asked him if Dan was welcome in his house at all or just not overnight. That actually surprised him. He said, of course Dan was welcome to visit, just not to sleep over. I felt relieved hearing that. He mentioned that we'd jumped to suggesting a lunch so quickly that he didn't even have a chance to bring up a day visit instead. Miscommunication strikes again. We ended the call agreeing that this year, meeting in a neutral restaurant made the most sense and we'd just plan better next year. He just couldn't resist adding, if Dan's still around, but he ended the call saying he missed us and was looking forward to lunch. Then came the talk with my daughter. She brought up the visit herself, asking when we would be going to see her grandparents. Her dad and I already knew what we'd say, we'd be meeting halfway for lunch this year instead. She was disappointed and asked why. I told her, as gently as possible, that some people just aren't comfortable with someone they don't really know staying overnight in their home. Before I could expand on her grandfather's reaction, she immediately made me laugh by asking if Grandpa still had a stick up his ass about her and Dan living together. And everyone who said she probably already knew? Absolutely correct. We ended up having a good laugh about old-fashioned values and how not everyone sees things the way we do. We talked about how people respond when a relationship seems to move quickly, her dad's and mine did too, and that attitudes can change in time, especially once people get to know each other. I told her I wasn't invited to sleep over until her dad and I were engaged, either, and that made her feel better. She laughed and said at least her grandfather was consistent. I reminded her that her dad and I support her and Dan 100%. She said she knew that, and that was that. I know it's not the dramatic fireworks some might expect. No huge blow-ups, no cutting people out, no secret white supremacist plot. In reality, it was a misunderstanding, some miscommunication, and judgmental moments, on both his part and mine. We're still going to see my in-laws, and Dan will be coming too, just not overnight. Things are fine with us and our daughter, and between us and my father-in-law. As for how things go between my daughter and her grandfather, I'm letting them handle it themselves. This will be the last update because, honestly, the issue is resolved. Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good night. Update 4. We picked a busy little place halfway between our town and theirs, neutral turf. Mill hugged Dan first like she'd been saving it up. Phil shook his hand, stiff, polite, and then ruined the moment by growling, I still don't approve of shacking up. My daughter didn't miss a beat. Good thing no one's asking to move into your house, Grandpa, she said, all sweet and deadly, and somehow that took the fuse right out of him. He harumphed and let it go. For all the worry and pacing and drafts of speeches I'd been rehearsing in my head, the first 20 minutes were normal. We talked about traffic and weather and whose green bean casserole had been a crime against taste buds last year. Dan asked Phil about his old fishing boat and actually listened to the answer. My husband looked like he was going to cry from relief every time a sentence landed without an explosion. Then the universe decided to throw in a moment that no one could have scripted. My sister-in-law's little girl, just turned 3, all ribbons and sticky fingers, started coughing. Not playful, not dramatic, the kind that makes your whole body go still. Sil froze. Mill shot to her feet and then just hovered. People at the next table stopped talking. And Dan moved. Calm, quick, the way you hope someone moves when you need it. 2 seconds later, a grate pinged onto a bread plate, the baby wailed, and the whole restaurant started breathing again. I didn't even know I'd grabbed my husband's arm until he pried my fingers off. Phil was white as his napkin. He stood there staring at Dan like he'd never seen him before. He reached across the table and patted his granddaughter's hair, and then he said, very quietly, "Thank you, Dan." "Not boy. Not anything snide." Dan nodded and went back to his chair like he hadn't just aged all of us 10 years. Everything after that was different. Not a Hallmark movie, but softer at the edges. Mill asked if we had time to drive back for cookies and coffee. Phil didn't look thrilled, but he didn't say no, and we all took that for what it was. We caravaned to their house, Christmas lights blinking against a gray sky, and I swear I felt my shoulders drop 2 inches when I saw their tree in the front window. Inside, Mill had stockings hung for everyone, and there was one for Dan. She had embroidered his name a little crooked, the end slants off like it's trying to escape, but there it was. Phil clocked it immediately. He looked at the mantle like it had betrayed him. He didn't take it down. He didn't comment. He just poured coffee and brought out the tin of those butter cookies that always taste like nostalgia and sugar. There were awkward pockets, sure. Phil couldn't resist taking a dig at kids today and their non-existent attention spans, which was extra funny because he then spent 10 minutes telling a story he's told every Christmas since 1998. But they laughed together. My daughter teased him about getting her one of those indestructible flip phones so she can live the way the Lord intended, and he grinned and said at least those phones didn't spy on you for the Chinese. We were all rolling our eyes in perfect harmony. It didn't feel like a battleground anymore. Before we left, Phil caught Dan on the porch while my husband and I were wrestling Mill into accepting leftovers. I didn't hear every word, but I saw the shape of it, Phil squaring his shoulders, Dan standing there with his hands in his pockets, not defensive, not deferential. Later, Dan told us what was said. Phil thanked him again. He said he's stubborn about his lines and that the no overnights rule was one of them. He told Dan he was welcome in his home, that he'd be treated as a guest, that he could look him in the eye and say, "I don't think you're a bad man." And he said, "You respect my house, I respect you." Dan told him he did. They shook hands. That was it. No grand apology, but something that mattered. If that had been the end of it, I would have driven home feeling like we'd landed the plane on one engine and a prayer. But then the real twist came. We got home, dumped our coats on the banister, and my phone rang. It was my daughter. She sounded shaky, in a good way. "Mom," she said, "don't freak out." Which, of course, made me immediately freak out. "And then?" he asked. I said yes. It turns out Dan had been carrying the ring around since Thanksgiving, waiting for the right moment. He wasn't going to do it at lunch. He said he didn't want their engagement to be born in the shadow of someone else's rules. They went home, put on pajamas, made hot cocoa, and he proposed in front of their own tree with that ridiculous crocheted star she made in 5th grade listing to the left like a drunken sailor. She said yes, they cried, she called us, and then she laughed and said she couldn't wait to see her grandfather try to decide whether a fiancé is still living in sin. And because timing is a comedian with excellent aim, the next morning Phil called my husband. He did not small talk. He cleared his throat and said, "Your girl called us. Congratulations." There was a pause, his stubbornness wrapping itself around the words. "Tell them I'm happy for them." Another pause. "If they come before the wedding, we'll set up the rooms." That was as close as he gets to a blessing. I'll take it. We're not suddenly a big, modern, enlightened family. My father-in-law is still the man he was last week, rigid, blunt, clinging to a rule book he thinks is the only thing holding the universe together. But he used Dan's name. He hung a stocking he didn't order. He let my daughter hug him goodbye without making a joke. He sent me home with a tin of cookies and told me to make sure the boy, Dan, gets some. Progress wears a funny coat sometimes. I keep thinking about that grape. One small, stupid thing that could have gone so badly and instead popped loose and rolled across a plate like a release valve. Maybe that's what all of this is. Tiny pieces of stuck old stories, dislodged one conversation at a time, one hard phone call, one crooked stitched stocking, one ring in a living room. No one was converted. No one was exiled. Something shifted anyway. Update 5. Mill called first thing after New Year's with that breathless brightness she saves for holidays and new babies. Their pastor wanted to say a few words over the engagement. Would we come to the Sunday service? My daughter rolled her eyes so hard I could hear it over the phone and then said fine, as long as no one was pinning scarlet letters to anybody's sweater. We drove down. Dan wore the suit that makes him look like he should be on the cover of a bank brochure. My daughter wore the ridiculous fuzzy coat she refuses to take off because it makes her feel like a rich Russian aunt. The church smelled like poinsettias and lemon oil. The same usher who's been shaking hands at that door since Clinton was in office called my husband sport and then did a double take when he saw Dan and said, "Good to have you with us, young man." I could feel my husband stand taller next to me, like the approval seeped straight into his bones. Halfway through the service, Pastor did the thing. Cleared his throat, looked over his glasses, and asked our newly engaged couple to come forward. I felt my husband's hand clench and then, to my genuine surprise, Phil beat all of us to standing. He walked out of our pew like he was late for a flight, squared his shoulders, and when my daughter and Dan were awkwardly trying to figure out where to stand so the church photographer wouldn't get their bad sides, Phil took the microphone. "This is my granddaughter," he said, and then he turned to Dan, "and this is her fiancé, Dan." He didn't swallow the word. He didn't choke on it. He said it like it belonged to him as much as it belonged to them. "They'll be married in due time," he finished, "and you'll treat him like you treat her." You could have heard a communion wafer drop. After, in the shuffle of hugs and bulletin folding, one of the older ladies in a hat big enough to shade a patio made a beeline for my daughter and started with the soft-voiced, heart-edged concern. "We're so glad to see you back in church, dear. I do hope you'll take this time too." And that was as far as she got. Phil stepped in so fast you'd think he'd been training for it his whole life. "Evelyn," he said, using the voice he usually reserves for people who park in his spot, "we'll let the young people make their decisions." He said it exactly like that. "We'll let. Not I'll let. We." Evelyn swallowed whatever she'd planned on delivering and patted my daughter's arm instead. My husband exhaled so hard he fogged up his own glasses. The rest of the day was an accidental snowball. Mill insisted we come back to their place for soup, which turned into laying out cookies, which turned into my daughter calling Dan's parents to swing by, which turned into an impromptu engagement open house by 5 o'clock. Their living room filled in layers, old church friends, our neighbors who'd driven down on a whim, my sister-in-law with a bag of clementines and a bottle of cava. Mill floated like a monarch butterfly. She had congratulations napkins that I know for a fact were not purchased that morning. I watched my world bend and refit around a single room. Dan's mom hugged me like she'd been waiting to do it for months. She hugged Phil, too, and he actually hugged back. Not the stiff shoulder bump. A real hug, 2 arms, 3 seconds. Later I heard him tell her quietly, "You raised a good man," and I almost pretended I didn't hear so the moment wouldn't notice and vanish. Somewhere between the second round of soup and the first round of story swapping, the storm that had been flirting with the edge of town rolled up its sleeves. The lights blinked. Mill froze with a tray of meatballs halfway to the table, and then we were in the dark except for the tree and the way a winter afternoon makes its own kind of dim. People did what people do, they laughed the way you laugh when you can't control the thing that's happening. Phones came out, flashlights tried to decide if they were bright enough to make a difference. Mill muttered, "Well, that's just perfect," and then Phil, of all people, said, "Everyone sit," like he had a plan. He did. The man who insists he is not sentimental and doesn't care for music except when it's in a hymn book walked to the old upright in the corner I've only ever seen used as a plant stand, set his coffee on top of it like he'd been doing it all his life, and flipped open the key cover. He cracked his knuckles, seriously, and started playing. Not Chopin. Not even Amazing Grace. The first thing out of that piano was "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," and I swear to you, the room shifted. You could hear the hammers find their confidence again after decades asleep. People started to sing along in the half-dark, off-key and full-hearted. My nephew found his guitar and joined in. Mill lit every candle she owned and suddenly the house was a little golden aquarium with all of us swimming in it. It wasn't fancy. It was better. Between songs, Phil stood up to give a toast in the most Phil way possible. "I don't make speeches," he began, making a speech. "I don't change my mind easy. But I know a man when I see one, and I know my granddaughter." He raised his glass, water, because the whiskey was in the bar cart that weighs as much as a cow and no one was about to wheel it, over in the dark. To doing things right. To doing things together. To light when the power goes out. We clinked whatever we were holding. Someone wiped their eyes and pretended it was the draft. At some point after the third round of Lean on Me, my daughter tugged me toward the hallway. "You have to see this," she said. "In the guest wing, it's not a wing, but Phil insists on calling it a wing like he's the Duke of somewhere, there were 2 rooms made up, doors propped open. On one, a little card in Mill's precise teacher handwriting, "Granddaughter." On the other, "Dan." The beds turned down, a stack of towels, a ridiculous peppermint on each pillow. On Dan's nightstand, a note in block letters that could only have been Phil's, "Bathroom light sticks. Jiggle chain twice." It was so ordinary and so specific I had to lean on the doorframe for a second. It's one thing to agree to a concept on the phone. It's another to label the rooms with your own hand. Before anyone asks, they stayed, separate rooms, without a fight. Not because anyone policed them. Because they decided that the relationship they're building is strong enough to handle one night of matching peppermint candies and a sticky chain. By morning the power was back, and the house smelled like coffee and the kind of bacon that should have its own NR rating. Phil was at the stove, of all places, flipping pancakes with the concentration of a surgeon. Dan's dad was teaching him the trick where you put a little extra vanilla in the batter and don't tell anyone why they're the best pancakes they've ever had. My husband looked like someone had taken an anvil off his chest and replaced it with a kitten. We did have the money conversation, because apparently we are doing every milestone in a 48-hour sprint. Phil put his fork down and said he wanted to host the engagement party properly in the spring, backyard, tent, the works. "We'll cover it," he added to the table, And then because he is who he is, if you'll let us. My daughter looked at Dan. Dan looked at her. They both looked at me and my husband like we were helpful. We were not. My daughter said, "We'll take the help, with no strings," and Phil, miracle of miracles, nodded. "No strings," he said, and then, because he is a man constitutionally incapable of not tethering things, "Just don't let anyone put lawn chairs on the pudding green." We all laughed and pretended he was joking. There was one more turn, the kind you don't plan, and it ends up being the spine of the story anyway. After breakfast, Pastor stopped by with a loaf of something wrapped in a dish towel and that pastoral ability to be in 4 places at once. He needed to check on a shut-in down the street. He just thought he'd swing past. He stood in our kitchen and talked about dates and officiants and the shape of a ceremony when 2 families come from different traditions and everybody wants to feel seen. He didn't pull out a lecture. He asked questions. He suggested something that didn't make my daughter break out in hives: premarital counseling that was less about catechism and more about logistics, money, conflict, the parts of life no one puts on Instagram. "We can do that," my daughter said. "We probably should." Pastor smiled and then, in that quiet way they practice in seminary, turned to Phil. "And you, Charles," he said, "your role is to love them loudly and mind your own business." I almost choked on my coffee. Phil blinked. And then, to my undying astonishment, he laughed. "I can try," he said. "You'll have to settle for that." By the time we loaded the car, Mill had pressed leftovers into our hands and the butter cookie tin was full of actual butter cookies again because she keeps them stored in some Narnia pantry where they regenerate. Phil stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who's just realized his house is big enough for more people than he thought. He called down to Dan, "Let me know what kind of beer your father likes. I'll stock it right next to mine." Dan grinned. "He doesn't drink beer," he said. "Ginger ale." Phil snorted. "Ginger ale it is." Like that. We drove home through fields still wearing their sugar dusting of snow. I kept thinking about the tree lit up against the dark and the way the piano sounded when it remembered it knew how to sing. There will be 100 more decisions and 3 dozen opportunities for someone to stomp off because the napkins are the wrong white or the wrong and was chosen. No one has been converted. No one has been exiled. But the rooms were labeled. The toast got said. The clapping was real, and somehow, in the middle of the winter and the stubbornness and the storm, everybody found their part. Progress, still wearing a funny coat. This time it smells like bacon and lemon oil and the kind of candle you only light when company's over.